Welcome to a special episode of Tell Us Your Story. I'm in the IPA studio today with Greg Rosshandler, who's the director of Peachtree Capital and has a long history in the manufacturing industry here in Australia. Greg, thanks for joining me on Tell Us Your Story.
Pleasure.
How are you today?
Excellent. Very good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. So we'll get right into things. Can you just tell us a bit about how you got started in business, how this whole journey began?
Yeah. Well, it began quite young, leaving school actually around about 16 and messing around on a few jobs and working. There was always an energy for work and a curiosity. So at 20, I actually started a manufacturing business which was making plastic bags, very ordinary plastic bags, and it wasn't magical. It was supplying at that time manufacturers who used it for women's hosiery. And I wasn't particularly clever. I just did it better and faster and quicker than my competitors. So you had a bag machine that probably cost, back there in 1968, $3,000 or $5,000. You stood behind the bag machine and it sealed and cut bags. And then I'd put them in the back of my car, write out an invoice, deliver them to Brunswick or wherever the factory was in the suburbs, and send them an invoice and hope that I collect my money in 7 or 30 days maximum, and that I would get another order for 3 or 5 million bags so that I could keep this machine running. And I did that for about a year, and then one day stood outside the little shop in High Street, Paran, and I said to everybody who walked in front of me, "You want a job? You want a job? You want a job? You want a job?" And this Greek gentleman put up his hand. He said, "I'd love a job." So I figured, let me do the selling and let him do the production. So in a very modest way, he was my first employee. And that over 40 years led to a business of about 470 people and 5 factories. And without boring you the details about that journey, I think the lesson in all of this is that I always went for value added. So you start with a commodity bag, you start to understand the industry, you end up with a laboratory with technicians, you end up targeting sophisticated work that you had fewer competitors for and where you had a higher barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And so I would always enjoy investing in the business. I even invest today in other businesses. I'm hungry always to invest. And if you invest, you're going to get the right result if you surround yourself with the right people. And those two things are very, very important. So today, when I'm doing some discussions on entrepreneurship, etc., I normally ask the students, what is an entrepreneur? Because I see myself as an unglamorous business builder. And a lot of people, read the papers today, read about entrepreneurs and, they make $1 billion and they think, wow, this is the game to be in.
Yeah.
And they forget this fellow's probably working with a smell of an oil rag for the last 30 years and he's been fortunate enough to make it. And he's probably, made it with the help of a lot of investors because it's difficult to fund those businesses. So my thoughts about being in business are often asking the person, are they built for being in business? Are they better as an executive? Do they have an appetite for risk? Do they have an appetite for worrying and working 24/7? And having debt, are they willing to pay the price of this? And there's a price you pay for everything in life. So if you want to be a good dad, you got to put in. And if you want to be a good husband, you got to put in. And if you want to build a business, you got to put in. And people often talk about balance, but I don't think it's about balance. It's about choices. And not everybody is made to run their own business and to take on these responsibilities and pressures we speak of.
You don't make it sound very glamorous with sleepless nights and the smell of an oil rag, and obviously it's a lot of hard work. But if that's the case, then why do you think, what's the benefit of entrepreneurship and why should young people
Well, I think there's
starting a
nothing,
business?
I think when it comes to, pride and dignity and success, it's a wonderful result of success. I think if there's anything that I didn't do enough of in regard to my business life, I didn't celebrate enough. I try and do that more, but that's got to do more with habit. So you're always striving, you're always somewhat fearful, you're always worrying about debt. And I think the moment all of those emotions disappear are the time you should probably, go fishing or playing golf. So I don't think I think being a movie star is more glamorous than being a businessman.
Yeah.
It's a lot of hard work, and it's a commitment that one is either wishing to make, and of course you can always exit. And most businesses, I think, go through 2 or 3 levels. You build a business, and you either sell the business because it's all too much worry, too much stress. You either build it and plateau the business, which means you're actually going backwards, or you embrace change and you take it to the next step, which is a journey of risk. And there's lots of failure, but I don't look at it as failure. I look at those things as all experiences.
Yeah.
And as long as you are on that journey and you are comfortable with the occasional ups and downs and disappointments and skills, consistency, managing people. That in itself is quite a skill, and most entrepreneurs who are used to having a fairly creative mind are not always the best managers of people. For that you need inclusiveness, you need patience, you need to know that people work and digest things at a different pace than you. So horses for courses. Not everybody is built for running their own business. Yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about how you wound things up with the manufacturing, and how you actually then got into property?
Well, so the manufacturing went on for 40 years. And at a certain point, there were 3 things that were happening. There were major customers like Arnott's Biscuits or Kimberly-Clark or Nestle or whatever, who were opening up the Asian market, and they wanted us as a reliable supplier here in Australia to open up in Asia because they trusted us, and so that was one junction. The second one was, what would that mean? That means I'd probably have to be on a plane 6 or 7 days in every month. So it's a major commitment. The third thing is that the multiples that they were paying for businesses at that time, in about just before the recession of 2018, about 2016, 17, were very, very high. So I came to the conclusion a lot of people don't know when to exit a business because they're fearful. They think, what am I going to do? Am I going to watch television? Am I going to play golf? What am I going to do? And it takes some years to get your mind together emotionally and intellectually in regard to the exiting of a business. And suddenly, instead of having extruders or printers or converters or laminators or a sophisticated equipment and labour, you have X amount of dollars and you have to become an investor, or you have to protect that in some way. So you have to learn those skills. And to me, that was challenging. And I would say that period probably lasted for about 3 or 4 years. So I always caution people when they sell a business, be careful you don't buy aeroplanes or change wives or buy other businesses too quickly.
Yeah.
And pay attention to the shift. And there is a big emotional and intellectual shift. So they were the sort of reasons, I'm sure there were a few more also, that made me think there is a time to exit this business, and 40 years seemed the appropriate time.
And then so it was a few years later that you started getting into property.
Exactly.
That was after the global financial crisis?
That's right. So the crisis hit in 2008, And then I spent time looking at many different businesses. It took me a while to move away from what I loved, which was manufacturing businesses, which work 24 hours, 7 days a week, exciting, energy, urgency, into something which was less intense, which is property. And property, like any business that I spoke of before, needs the same sort of attention, but it's different. You don't have a customer that rings you 3 in the morning and says, listen, I've got to have this delivery because we've got to deliver to Woolworths and we need, 5 ton of material to go onto our filling machines so that we can wrap our best biscuits or whatever product is in there. So it's quite a different shift, but it's an appropriate shift because unless you've got succession and unless you have family that want to enter that business and again are skilled to enter that business, I think the wise thing is to reach a certain point where you examine the options and take what seems as a hard decision but ends up a good, healthy decision. There's just this period of adjustment that I speak of. And
I'd like to go back to something that you said earlier, which was about understanding yourself and understanding if you're an entrepreneurial person.
Yes.
And also understanding if you would be a good partner or if someone you're thinking of working with would be a good partner.
Yeah.
How do you, if you've just finished school or you're in university, how do you think young people can figure out those questions?
Well, I think the first thing is, and I'm not sure if that's DNA, but I think a lot of his DNA is your own energy for work and for curiosity and for excellence. So you might find that, as I did, I mean, I was always working, be it the weekends, washing cars as a young kid, or wanting to be independent, financial independence gives you options. That's the attractive thing about financial independence. So I think that you can go through journeys where you may have a partnership and you learn from that and you say this is very successful because the business is successful. Not everybody grows with the business. You may find that you may be growing with the business, but the partner that you agreed on together on terms, 10 years ago, has become more comfortable or more restful and not wishing to take on further risk. So I think there isn't a one fits all. I think it's more about one's own drive for where they want to go, and does the marriage and the partnership, are they on the same page? And they can be on the same page for a period of time, and then they cannot be on the same page. They can change. And sometimes you might have a situation then where you buy out your partner, or you don't have the cash to buy out your partner. So if you think forward, you can say, well, I've brought in a partner and I'm going to look for certain ways to exit this marriage in time, which you agree with a partner, so that if in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, both persons are moving in two different directions, you can have an option to buy your partner at market value, maybe payable over 2 or 3 years with commercial interest rates.
Yeah.
So there's creative ways of building a business and constantly looking forward. And that's my job as a business person, constantly looking forward. So when I'm looking at a property now, I'm saying, what is the tenant of the future going to want? What's he going to be concerned about? Well, straight away we can think, particularly after the COVID, about air circulation, about health, about how many people are going to sit in an office together, how many people will be working from home, what kind of hybrid will evolve out of this. So because we're sort of still early in the pandemic, it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years. But I think it's your job as the driver to ask yourself those questions all the time, instead of just sitting on what you have presently and say, well, that will do, that's the office. The important thing is to say to the customer of the future and the customer of the present, what are your needs? What do you think you will want so that I can support and supply that?
Yeah.
And you may have a partner who is exceptionally skilled in the technical level or the administrative level, because you're never going to find one person doing all these things, because you need in a business a salesperson, a driver, somebody who's looking forward, somebody who's skilled in administration, somebody who's skilled in tax, all of these things. So the key of that driver is to say, I've got to surround myself with the best people. And that is a difficult challenge, because everybody wants the best people. But that means you've got to be able to hire the person, be very clear in the brief of your expectations of that person, and be very clear that when you review that in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or whatever you've agreed upon, that if it's not working as you've both planned, that you can exit.
Yeah.
And that's not a pleasant job for a person that runs a business, because you're dealing with emotions. You're talking about a person that may have children, mortgages, etc. So all of these things are, in my opinion, they're hard. And occasionally you get some real wonderful wins because you've worked at it for a long time to purchase a particular property or to secure a wonderful a long-term tenant, and they should be celebrated. But I think, without making it sound too tough, all of these things fall under the umbrella of focused, disciplined, hard work.
And so thinking about a young person who thinks that they're hardworking, they're determined, they've got a bit of an appetite for risk.
Yes.
But they've never done anything in business before. They've never tried to start a business.
Yes.
Where do you think they should? What's the first step?
Well, I think the first step is probably with a person with this kind of energy, that he's got a few dollars in his back pocket, because that'll give him a few options. And if you don't have a few dollars in your back pocket, then you are already going to say to yourself, gosh, I can't even fund thinking about what I want. So that immediately gets you in a situation of investors and partners. But it's difficult. Today, of course, we are in a increasingly competitive environment. So education is, to me, the most important. So even if you leave school early, you have a responsibility to keep on reading, to keep on learning, to keep on growing, to keep on working. If I was 16 or 17 or 19 today, I would say, gosh, what am I going to do in the weekend? How much do I want to party and how much do I want to work? Because the more strength I've got in pursuing my options, and the more dollars I've got, as I said, the few bucks in your back pocket will give you some options. Yeah. So they're the ingredients you need for a start. And when you are working and when you are active, you are exposed to a whole lot of things that you don't even think about. You're exposed to, somebody who comes to a supermarket because you're at the checkout and you know that there's a pattern and people spend money on their payday and not at the beginning of the week. I remember as a young boy when I used to serve gas for in a car, and I'd figure out how come it's busy on a Thursday. And I mean, maybe my mind wasn't too smart, but that's when people got paid. Yeah. And that's when they fill their car up. And that's when you learnt that you don't put, water in the petrol tank, and and you learn all this small stuff. Yeah. That leads to opening your mind to understanding and learning about people, behaviour, opportunities. They come by actively being engaged, and then options come to you. But I go back to my initial comment about education. This is very, very important. It's not so much that you have to have a certificate on your wall. Yeah. It's knowing, first of all, that if I don't want to go in business, I better be an excellent engineer, or I better be an excellent skilled person in law or commerce. The word I repeat all the time is this word excellence, because this ought to be your focus. This ought to be your target. This ought to be your agenda. And you're either built that way. I'm not quite sure how many people embrace this later. I think some of this starts at a very young age when you're bringing up your own children and you sit at a table and you talk to them about how they, hold a knife and hold a fork and how they eat with their mouth closed or how they don't interrupt a parent. I mean, all sounds kind of strict and tough, but it makes life actually quite easy because you don't have to try and educate them at 12 years old how to do this, because that's going to be much more difficult. So there is a lot of fun, but there is, as I said, a lot of disciplined hard work.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few times there having a few dollars gives you some options. And you mentioned at the beginning about getting into something with high barriers to entry.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because I've heard you say before you should go into a business where you have to invest a lot of money because it deters other people from doing the same.
Yes.
And I think nowadays young people are often told, well, all you need to start a business is your laptop, because you can, because there's all these tech companies that all it was an entrepreneur in their laptop. But you disagree.
Yes,
so can you,
I disagree.
Can you
the laptop is a wonderful tool for education. It's a tool.
Yeah.
And not everybody has to go into sophisticated businesses where there are high barriers to entry. If I want to work in a restaurant and I find that, gosh, I could do a few things better than this fellow who runs this restaurant. I mean, restaurants are the same. They're all selling food. You've just got to do it better than other people. So when I talk about high barriers to entry, when I talk about manufacturing, for example, if you're making commodity plastic bags for garbage bags or for, as I began with, hosiery bags, and you want to get into sophisticated packaging for, the lid of yogurt, for example, where you might have 2 or 3 substrates for shelf life, for odour, you need sophisticated extruders to laminate a special recipe. If you want to make medical packaging, which would be a good industry, given that people's awareness of medical needs and safety and cleanliness, etc., there are only few people in that industry because the barriers to entry are very high. And if you're selling that to hospitals, they are highly unlikely to change suppliers for a few cents.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're making bags for grocery shopping or for hosiery bags, for 3 cents cheaper, somebody else would do it and deliver it a little bit faster. So one should always go for higher barriers to entry where your competitor's got to scratch his head and say, gosh, to do this, I've got to spend $5 million on an extruder. I've got to have a laboratory with 4 or 5 technicians. All of this costs a lot of money. And that separates the men from the boys. But as you get into these areas of value add, your pricing is better, you'll get a better margin, and you'll have fewer competitors. But you've got to want to have that mentality of investing.
Yeah.
And so I have that mentality even with property. I will invest even when it's not necessary. If I think the elevator looks tired, I will invest $1 million in those elevators. If I think the foyer looks tired, I will spend a few $1 million in doing that superbly. And you don't always need to do it, but if you do it and you have a situation like, for example, the COVID crisis, and you have good tenants, you've looked after them, they're in a beautiful building, you've given them first-class service in regard to their needs from everything, from air conditioning to security, you will find that you sit in a good place today versus somebody who has not looked after their asset and has a half-empty building and will wait in this environment for 2 years to get a tenant. So investing to me is a very simple, healthy, smart way of building your business.
And you mentioned COVID, so we should pick up on that. Do you think that, how do you think business in Australia is going to be different? Do you think that if someone's starting a business now, are things different for them than it would have been if they started a business 4 years ago?
Shall I tell you, I think that that starting a business and recognising opportunities can happen when the market is soft, But even what has happened in this state with a lot of industries that have been very smashed, like the hospitality industry, restaurant industry, etc. Again, people still nevertheless have to eat. One has to give more thought as to the location of that restaurant. One has to give more thought in regard to the how you separate and identify your business versus the guy down the road. But I don't think you can choose your times. I think it's more about recognising opportunities, and it can start off in a very competitive area like I began, where there were lots of people doing commodity stuff, but it can move up the scale from a coffee house to a sophisticated restaurant if that's your objective. So I don't think this should scare anybody off. I just think one should recognise, in regard to offices, for example, a sort of hybrid where there will be a mixture of offices, but at the end of the day, you will still very much need that culture, that head office, that interface communication. But you may find that there are certain aspects of that office where somebody is doing payroll or an administrative job where there isn't a great deal of interface other than picking up the telephone, and they want to spend more time with their children or with their family or whatever. So I think eventually all of this will improve. It will be slow because you've got to remember we haven't even opened up our borders internationally yet. We haven't got tourism going yet. We haven't got education going yet. So we are fortunate that we are a big island and that we're very protected and that we're doing a good job. But we're only, in my opinion, about a third through this journey. I think we've still got another 2 or 3 years to go with hiccups and shutdowns, and how they will be dealt with will tell us how quickly we can move forward. But you've got to remember that the whole world is impacted by this. So it's a big job to open up your borders and trade internationally and do all the things that we've been used to.
I think early on when coronavirus came into Australia, people quickly started talking about domestic manufacturing capabilities, and not being able to get PPE equipment from overseas or face masks or whatever it was. What do you think the future of... Can we still manufacture in Australia?
Well, I think, again, we're talking mainly products there which are commodities, dealing with countries that manufacture them where they have low cost compared to Australia, improving technology. I think we are a high cost country, and so one has to say, what part of those products can I manufacture in this country where I can identify a product which is different than a commodity product, which will still be required by consumers in this country. Now, I can't think of anything offhand because I'm not in that industry. But can we compete with masks? No, we can't. If you're dealing with the Chinese economy and you're talking about, as I said, low cost, high productivity, improving technology, there's no way we can compete. But I'm sure we can compete with products that they're not interested in, although they're moving towards that as well. The Chinese are moving similar to the Japanese, where they went to value added, and before you know it, the Japanese were making Lexus cars and Panasonic and televisions and all the sort of things which, people would have thought 50 or 60 years ago they were just manufacturing ordinary commodity products. And I think the Chinese economy is moving into value added all the time. What I would do, I think, if I was a young man, I'd probably go to a few of the fairs which they have in Chicago and in McCormick Centre there, and Birmingham and Cologne and Beijing, And often they have these incredible exhibitions which are for particular sectors of industry. They can be for hygiene, they can be for food, they can be for agriculture. I used to do this probably once a year, where I would visit these and I would always learn something. I would come across somebody in McCormick Centre in Chicago who is looking for an agent in Australia for fire extinguishers and things like I can't even recall. But there's always opportunities. So travel is important.
Yeah.
An open mind is important. So it's not as if you go there saying, I'm going to look because I definitely want to bring in products which are associated with hygiene. I think what you do is you open up your mind, and you don't need a great deal of money for that. You stay at an ordinary motel, you get tickets for 2 or 3 days, because it takes 2 or 3 days to absorb what is in these massive exhibitions, and you see current technology, future technology, and for somebody that is creative and thoughtful and looks at that and says, gosh, we don't have that in Australia. And you might find, as I did with one of my products, I picked up an agency and I brought that back to Australia, and I was the first in, best dressed, and the product did particularly well. So I go back to my initial conversation about having an open mind in regard to opportunities.
So before I let you go, are there any opportunities that you missed or anything that you did different that you would have done differently? If you had your time again, is there anything you would have changed?
I think I would have spent a little bit more time investing in other activity than the business, be it a sport activity. I think that I gave up tennis quite young, and came to a time in your life where you understand that you have to be healthy and fit. And now I'm paying much more attention to this. But I think I would have loved to have spent maybe 10 or 15% of my time engaging more in activities beyond the business. So that's, as I say at the beginning of the discussion, part of the price you pay.
Yeah.
And you look back and say, well, that would have been nice. Would the businesses have been as big? I'm not sure, maybe. But I don't have any regrets about the journey. I think the journey has been interesting and stimulating, and there's not much that I wouldn't have done. I've enjoyed the challenge.
Perfect. All right, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on, tell us your story and
Pleasure.
Talking to me about your journey.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.